Thank you for joining us around the fire. For more information or to make a donation, please visit randomactsnetwork.com. Now, want to hear a scary story? A long time ago, there lived a skillful scientist who had experienced a spiritual reaction more striking than any chemical one. He had left his laboratory in the care of his assistant, washed the chemicals away from his hands, and asked a beautiful woman to become his wife. In those days, new scientific discoveries, such as electricity, seemed to open paths into areas of miracles. It was not unusual for the love of science to compete with the love of a woman. The scientist's name was Almer. He had so totally given himself to scientific studies that he could not be weakened by a second love. His love of his young wife could only be the stronger of the two if it could link itself with his love of science. Such a union did take place with truly remarkable results. But one day, very soon after their marriage, Almer looked at his wife with a troubled expression. In the center of Georgiana's left cheek was a mark, deep in her skin. The mark was usually a deep red color. When Georgiana blushed, the mark became less visible. But when she turned pale, there was the mark, like a red stain upon the snow. The birthmark, shaped vaguely like a small human hand, would come and go with the emotions in her heart. Past lovers would say that the hand of a magical fairy had touched her face as a child. Many men would have risked their lives for the honor of kissing that mysterious hand, but other people had different opinions. Some women said the red hand destroyed the effect of Georgiana's beauty. Some men, who did not favor the mark, simply wished it away so they did not see it. After his marriage, Almer discovered that this was the case with himself. Had Georgiana been less beautiful, he might have felt his love increased by the prettiness of that little hand. But because she was otherwise so perfect, he found the mark all the more repulsive. Almer saw the mark as a sign of his wife's eventual sadness, sickness, and death. Soon, the birthmark caused him more pain than Georgiana's beauty had ever given him pleasure.
Georgiana,
he said,
have you ever considered the mark upon your cheek might be removed?
No, she said, smiling. But seeing the seriousness of his question, she said, the mark has so often been called a charm that I was simple enough to imagine it might be so.
On another face it might, but not on yours. No, dear, nature made you so perfectly that this small defect shocks me as being a sign of earthly imperfection.
Shocks you? Cried Georgiana, deeply hurt. Her face reddened and she burst into tears. Then how could you marry me? How could you love what shocks you? During a period that should have been their happiest, Almer could only think of this disastrous subject. With the morning light, Almer opened his eyes upon his wife's face and recognized the sign of imperfection. When they sat together in the evening near the fire, he would look at the mark. Georgiana soon began to fear his look. His expression would make her face go pale, and the birthmark would stand out like a red jewel on white stone. Do you remember, dear Almer? She asked with a weak smile. About the dream you had last night? About this hateful mark? He rubbed the sleep from his eyes, the memory of his dream returning. He had imagined himself with his assistant trying to remove the birthmark with an operation. But the deeper his knife went, the deeper the small hand sank until it had caught hold of Georgiana's heart. Almer felt guilty remembering the dream. Almer, pleaded Georgiana, we do not know what the cost could be, to both of us, to remove this birthmark. I fear being left deformed, or with damage to my health.
Dearest Georgiana, I have spent much thought on the subject. I am sure it can be removed.
Georgiana exhaled, looking away. Life is not worth living while this mark makes me the object of your horror. You are deeply knowledgeable and have made great discoveries. Please, Elmer, remove this mark for the sake of your peace and my own.
Dearest wife,
He deliberately kissed her unblemished cheek.
I am ready to make this cheek as perfect as its other half.
The next day, the couple went to Almer's laboratory, where he had prepared a beautiful room for his wife. Though he had previously made several famous discoveries, Almer's series of powerful experiments failed, one by one. The mark remained. Georgiana waited in her room, reading through his notebooks of experiments and observations. She could not help but notice that many of his experiments had ended in failure. She decided to see for herself the scientist at work. The first thing that struck Georgiana when she entered the laboratory was the hot furnace. From the amount of soot above it, it seemed to have been burning for ages. She saw machines, tubes, cylinders, and other containers for chemical experiments. What most drew her attention was Almer himself. He was nervous and pale as death as he prepared a liquid. Georgiana realized that her husband had been hiding his tension and fear. You think so little of me that you couldn't be honest about the risks we are taking?
My dear, nothing shall be hidden. I have already given you chemicals powerful enough to change your entire physical system.
I will drink whatever you give me, even if it's a poison.
My dear, you've got just one thing left to try. If it fails, we are ruined.
He led her back to her room, where she waited once more alone with her thoughts. She hoped that for just one moment she could satisfy her husband's highest ideals, but she realized then that his mind would forever be on the march, always requiring something newer, better, and more perfect. Hours later, Alma returned, carrying a crystal glass with colorless liquid.
The chemical process went perfectly. Unless all my science has tricked me, it cannot fail.
To test the liquid, he placed a drop in the soil of a dying flower growing in a pot. In a few moments, the plant danced back to life, becoming healthy and green once more. Give me the glass, Georgiana said quietly. I do not need proof. She drank the liquid and immediately fell asleep. Almer sat next to his wife, observing her and taking notes. He noted everything, her breathing, the movement of an eyelid. He stared at the birthmark, and slowly, with every breath that came and went, it lost some of its brightness.
By heaven, it is nearly gone.
He opened the window coverings to see her face in daylight. She was so pale. Georgiana opened her eyes and looked into the mirror her husband held. She tried to smile as she saw a barely visible birthmark.
My dear, success.
My poor Almer, she said, gently. With so high and pure a feeling, you have rejected the best the earth could offer. As the last trace of color disappeared from her cheek, she gave her last breath. His eyes rested on her barren, snow-colored cheek. She was so alluring, even in death. Yet, without the rosy hand embellishing her face, her commanding beauty was no more, leaving behind an average facade unworthy of note. A plain face could so quickly be forgotten. In trying to improve his lovely wife, he had failed to realize that she had been perfect all along.
The Birthmark, story by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Adapted by Bryan Renaud. Told by Shannon Leigh Weber. Featuring Aaron Holland.